Good morning. Welcome.
Hey, good morning. My name is Pat Forde. I'm chairman of the Rhode Island Libertarian Party. Just a quick editorialization, and I too have condensed my notes significantly. An earlier gentleman, I believe 2 gentlemen ago, pointed out the politicization of the tragedy and that took place just a week ago in Florida. I too am disgusted by that. The governor of the state of Rhode Island issued via internet on the Facebook, if you will, a simplistic one-page question about gun violence, followed up by a quick request for campaign contributions. That, in conjunction with the embarrassment that was the executive order that took place the next day, is, regardless of your stance on this issue, an affront to both the state and federal constitution, and really, I think, put the Rhode Island State Police in a very tenuous position and clearly had no regard for civil liberties. Briefly, again, my name is Pat Forde. I am chairman of the Rhode Island Libertarian Party. As I always say, haven't heard of us? You will. Over 15,000 Rhode Islanders voted for our presidential candidate, Gary Johnson, in the 2016 presidential election. I am a voluntarist. I voluntarily submit to be governed. I consent. I reserve the right to withdraw at any time. The right to bear arms, to defend oneself, transcends any written constitution, federal or state. It is a right ultimately we are born with. It is absolute, with a law drawn only at aggression, not possession. Legally, the federal Constitution and the Rhode Island Constitution is equally absolute. The text of the Constitution expressly guarantees the right to bear arms, not just to right to keep them. Many in this chamber successfully, and I rather say heroically, defend the First Amendment, quite religiously. I would say at this point in time that they perhaps should spend equal amount of time both reading, appreciating the history of, and defending the Second Amendment, as the Fourth, as the Ninth. It is the time that the Second Amendment be taken just as seriously. As a defensive force, the government and law enforcement of this nation has failed egregiously despite extensive legislation, very often feel-good legislation, guarded sometimes or cloaked in the cloak of humanity, or sometimes in the cloak of the American flag. People have previously mentioned Texas, Florida. I'll add the Tsarnaev brothers just up the road in Boston a few years ago, 9/11 itself. The government routinely creates legislation, it creates power, it spends money, and routinely fails egregiously, despite clear connections to really support the law that it so aggressively pursues. It was just a few short years ago, and let me mention again the elephant in the room, the reason why we need a well-regulated militia. The federal government just a few years ago in this nation interned thousands of American citizens and took their property because of their race being Japanese. A first world nation just a few short weeks ago, Spain, with whom we are a NATO partner, fired upon peaceful civilians, the Catalans, simply because they wished to pursue a local election. Fired upon them. The citizenry has the right to maintain this well-ordered militia because of a track record across this world, within immediate memory, of the type of oppression around the world that the citizens, frankly, weren't armed to fight. We focused briefly on the red flag legislation. Constitutionally, this is an abomination. I routinely support, by the way, the work of the American Civil Liberties Union, particularly here in Rhode Island. I have found their adherence to constitutional principles to be quite remarkable. This legislation, as written, I'm referring directly to their, and I want to enter into the record. A person could be subject to an extreme risk protective order without ever having committed or even having threatened to commit an act of violence with a firearm. While aimed at responding to red flags, this bill sets a low threshold for judicial intervention, particularly when one compares it to the myriad and blatant red flag warnings that the Parkland shooter left but that were ignored by law enforcement agencies. And contrary to popular belief, the bill is not limited to addressing people who pose an immediate threat of harm. In short, there is a great disparity between whom the bill actually affects and the high-profile shooting incidents that made passage of this legislation seem so pressing. The court order authored by this legislation could be issued without any indication that the person poses an imminent threat to others. The order could be issued without any evidence that the person ever committed or has even threatened to commit an act of violence with a firearm, for whom I might add, laws already exist for prosecution. The court order would require the confiscation for at least a year of any firearms lawfully owned by the person and place the burden on him or her to prove by clear and convincing evidence that they should be returned after that time. If denied, the person would have to wait another year to petition for return of his or her property. Throughout this state's recent history, we have had to constantly litigate for the return of property by an overreaching police department. Especially egregious, the person could be subjected to a coerced mental health evaluation, and the court decision on that and all these other matters would be made at a hearing where the person would not be entitled to appointed counsel. My addition, when used in conjunction with this body's recent decision to allow warrantless searches of the prescription medical database, you have a clear abrogation of your fundamental responsibility as a state to protect civil liberties and a clear abrogation of these people's ability to enjoin against the government, clearly on 10, for potentially, in the future, egregious political speech. With the issuance of an order, police would have had broad authority to search the person's property. Yeah, there's that tricky Fourth Amendment there again. Gotta hate that. The standard for seeking and issuing an order is so broad that it would routinely be used against people who engage in, air quotes, overblown political rhetoric on social media or against alleged gang members when police want to find a shortcut to seize lawfully owned weapons from them. I would argue that this body in particular has been very aggressive in shall we say, supporting legislation at the city of Providence level against organizations like the Jump Out Boys from the Providence Police Department. We rightfully saw in situations where stop and frisk or aggressive use of law enforcement against the war on drugs was seen as an abrogation of individual civil rights, where people were classified by their race or ethnic background. We saw that then, and yet we as a legislative body, as a state, would endorse this atrocity? Absolutely not. It's time to reel it back. As terrible, and like most of the people who testified in this room, I have children in school age. As terrible as the tragedy of Parkland was, as terrible as the tragedy of Houston, let's not forget Fort Hood, the ultimate, irony, a gun-free zone in a military installation. The atrocities in California. The fact that we are a violent society is not an issue to be dismissed easily, but there are certainly other issues supporting the causal relationship between family structure, between economic violence, between a number of reasons that have caused this type of violence in our society. However, disarming a populace and leaving them, if you will, prone or subject to the whims of law enforcement in order to protect them on a daily basis is not only wrong, it is expressly forbidden in both the Rhode Island State Constitution as well as our federal Constitution. To that I say, to hell with this bill, throw it out. It is not worth the paper it was written on, and it's time, quite frankly, to stop this emotional cascade, if you will, against individual civil rights and just start all over from fresh. Thank you very much.